sense of a purpose and a goal was filled through religion in a very deep and powerful way, and we're missing that in the world. So I maintain in Mastery that there is another way of looking at your life, a much different approach, one that I obviously promulgate. And it goes like this. Each human being, each one of you, was born completely unique. Your DNA never occurred in the past and will never again occur in the future. An incredible thought if you ever spend time to think about, to ponder that. The same thing could be said about your brain. Your brain is configured in a particular way that has never happened in the past, will never happen in the future. This uniqueness that you're born with is there's a purpose, there's a reason behind it. Our culture, who we are, depends on the diversity of people that exist within it, each person bringing their own personal skills, their own uniqueness to bear it within our culture, expressing all of these different skills and ideas, creating this kind of rich soil. It's why we celebrate a period in history like the Renaissance. So this uniqueness that you were born with is your purpose, is your fate, is your destiny. Now, how does this uniqueness that each one of you have, how does it manifest itself? It manifests itself beginning at the age of 3 or 4 years old. You probably can't remember it, but as a child, you were naturally drawn to certain things, to certain activities. You're very young, it's a pre-verbal thing. You're drawn to certain patterns, to certain ways of thinking, to rhythms, to music, perhaps to a physical activity. Albert Einstein, when he was 5 years old, his father gave him a compass, and he suddenly looked at this compass, and the idea that the needle would move according to this magnetism in the North Pole, it fascinated him that there was this invisible force that existed in the universe. From that moment on, all he could think about were these forces that you couldn't see but that acted upon the physical world. That was his uniqueness manifested at the age of 5. I have in the book the great African-American writer Zora Neale Hurston. She realized at the age of 6 that she was obsessed with mythology that took her well beyond the black township that she lived in Florida. And she realized at that point that it was words itself and creating this kind of mythic universe that obsessed her. That was her manifestation of this uniqueness. Steve Jobs, when he's 6 years old, he sees these electronic gadgets in his garage, and he's fascinated with these electronic gadgets and how they work, not just how they work, but the look of them and the design of them. As we get older, as we get 7 or 8 or 9 years old, these differences, these inclinations, I call them primal inclinations, they become a little clearer. They're not so nebulous. We realize that we were meant to be a writer or to do sports. One person I forgot to mention that I love is Tiger Woods. He's 16 months old. He's sitting in the high chair. He can't even walk yet. And he's watching his father hit golf balls in the garage against a net. And he's like, he can't wait until he can get on his feet and start imitating his father. Anyway, as we get older, it becomes a little clearer what these natural inclinations are. I liken it to a voice inside our head. It's a metaphor. There's not literally a voice, at least I hope not. But there's like a voice. And it's saying, this is what you should be doing, Noman, or whoever it is. This is what you should be drawn to. This is what you were meant to accomplish. When you do it, you feel an ease, a kind of power. If it's playing the piano, it doesn't mean that you don't have to practice. There's still a lot of pain. But in doing it, you feel this kind of natural ease. It works. Whereas if you do something that doesn't fall within this wheelhouse, what you were meant to do, you experience the opposite. You experience a lot of resistance. This voice is telling you, this is what you're drawn to. This is what you should be doing. Now, what happens with most people, I maintain, is that voice that we have gets fainter and fainter and fainter. The first thing that intervenes is usually the education system. We have to start, we're interested in books and literature, and now we have to start learning algebra, and suddenly this pain in our head, and and it means, maybe I don't like learning at all. Maybe I don't like education. And then it infects how we naturally love writing itself. The second thing that intervenes is our parents. God bless them. But they sometimes say, you don't want to be a dancer. You don't want to be a writer. You don't want to be an entrepreneur. You need to go here. And we take it seriously, and we listen to them. And then there are our peers. They're all interested in this particular field, and we're naturally conformists, and we find that that's something that infects us. More and more down the line, to the point where we don't even hear that voice anymore. And we're finishing our graduate work, or we're finishing the university system, we're about to enter the career world, and we've completely disconnected ourselves from that. And suddenly, when those critical first choices come up that I mentioned before, we take a wrong step. We don't know really what's to guide us in those early moments. And generally what happens, I think, with a lot of people is if they do take a wrong step, in your 20s, you can kind of fake it. You're young, you look good, you have a lot of energy and enthusiasm, and you can get by. You don't have to be completely in love with what you do. But as you get into your 30s, it starts to catch up with you, the fact that you're not in love with what you do. You're not really engaged with it. You're not emotionally connected to it. So you start not paying less attention. You become more interested in your hobbies and in a family and playing golf or whatever. You lose connection to the changes going on in your field. And then all of a sudden in your late 30s and maybe early 40s, the worst thing that can happen to you happens. You become replaceable. Somebody younger, better looking, more in touch with trends, and a lot cheaper, they're going to replace you. And now where are you? You're in a lot of troubles where you are. Well, masters, people who are powerful, people who are successful, they hear that voice when they're 8 or 9 years old. They hear it even more as they get older, as they enter adolescence. That voice may fade in and may fade out a little bit. It happens to everyone. It's human nature. But it keeps coming back. It keeps directing them to a particular career, to a particular direction that they're going to take in life. The fact that they feel that they have to make a particular discovery, they have to invent this kind of business, they have to express some idea in a book. This gives them a deep emotional connection to what they're learning, to what they're studying. And we know from the neuroscience of how the brain works that a person who's paying deep attention, who's focusing, who's really listening, is going to learn much faster than someone who's disengaged, who's bored. So the faster you learn, the more skill you develop. The more skill you develop, the more pleasure you're having in learning. And then you enter what I call a cycle of accelerated returns that will lead you to creative energy and to mastery. Being emotionally connected to what you're doing, being personally involved and excited, pushes you, gives you this incredible momentum that pushes you past all of the obstacles that usually stop a lot of people. You have the patience and the persistence being the most important quality in this world for achieving mastery and success, because you have a reason for doing it, a purpose. You can push past the criticisms that that you're inevitably going to face. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't an element of chance involved with people who are masters, who are hearing this voice. Of course, there'll be opportunities that come up that they hadn't foreseen. It's within all of their stories. But what they have is they can recognize what a real opportunity is and exploit it from a false path, from a path they shouldn't be taken. A lot of people make choices dependent on money or getting attention. They make the choices from inner reasons. This is something I have to do. This is something that attracts me personally. And because of that, they make all of the right choices. All of these people, and I've interviewed many of them. I interviewed 9 contemporary masters in the book. I've worked, as Noman said, I did a book with 50 Cent, but I consult with a lot of them. And all of the people that I've researched, they all express this sense of destiny or fate. They were destined to do what they ended up doing. They felt it as a child, and they felt it later on in life, all the way through. Now, I know this might seem abstract or poetic to you, so I want to give you two examples of this idea in action and how it could affect your life. One a historical example, one a contemporary one, that show two different approaches to this sense of fate or destiny guiding you. And the first one, they're both narrated in my story, by the way. And the first one is a historical example. It's the scientist Michael Faraday. I don't know how many of you have heard of Michael Faraday. He was born in the 1790s in England. His father was a blacksmith. He had a family of 12. A blacksmith is very low on the social class system. Blacksmiths don't make a lot of money. But to make matters worse, Michael Faraday's father was continually ill, so he couldn't work very much. He had 12 children to support. In other words, Michael Faraday came from extreme abject poverty in London, England in the 1790s. And yet he went on to become one of the greatest experimental scientists that ever existed. It was his discoveries that led to the electric motor and to the field theories that revolutionized science and led to the theory of relativity and all of the technological wonders around him. And so you might say, well, this is a story of a man who overcame a lot of adversity. But that doesn't even begin to explain the story of Michael Faraday. To be a scientist in England in the early 19th century, you had to have access to laboratories. You had to have access to scientific journals, to the work of your peers in science. The only people who could do that were people who went to university. And you could count the number of universities on one hand that were available in England for that. To get to a university, you had to go to one of the great, they call them public schools, what we would call private schools in England, a place like Eton. To get into Eton, you had to come from the upper classes. Nobody from the background of Michael Faraday could begin to enter that process. He wasn't facing a glass ceiling, he was facing a concrete wall. It is absolutely impossible that somebody like that could have had a career in science. So how did it happen? Well, I'll try to explain. He came from a family that was very religious. And part of their religious belief, it was a weird sect called Saint-Dominians. Part of their religious belief was that the Spirit of God manifested itself in everything around you, in lights, in carpets, in trees and flowers. God was there in everything. And young Michael Faraday, from the age of 6, 7 years old, was obsessed with this idea. And he looked at everything around him, the clouds in the sky, the plants, and he wondered, how was God's presence manifested in these things? And he was asking endless questions of his parents and everyone he could find. And one day, this intense, very curious young man wandered into a local bookseller. It was like a bookseller and a bookbinding shop. And this was the first time he had really ever seen books besides the Bible, because he did not go to school, he was not educated. And he was just amazed by the sight of these books. And the owner of the of the bookstore, was very charmed by this intense young man. And so they became friends. And young Michael kept returning to the bookshop. And so finally the bookseller sort of decided he would help him, and he offered young Michael a job as an errand boy. And because they were so poor, he had to accept it, but he was very excited to be connected to this bookseller. So he worked as an errand boy, and he had such a great work ethic that the owner said, all right, I'm going to offer you a position as an apprentice bookbinder. And this was an amazing coup for him. Now, for 7 years, he would serve as an apprentice, and at the end, he would have a craft as a bookbinder, and the amount of money he could make as a bookbinder was amazing compared to where he came from. So he accepted. For the first 2 years, the owner was absolutely in love with this young boy because he never had seen anybody with such an incredible work ethic. And so he offered young Michael something that he had never offered before. He said, look, the books I have in my bookshop, you're never going to find in any library in all of London. I want you to take any book that you want and take it home and read it. You can read any book that we have. And so he took this seriously, and he read everything in the bookshop. And soon he realized that what he really loved was science, and in particular, electricity and chemistry. What fascinated him about electricity and chemistry was that there was this sort of unknown thing going. Something happened that you couldn't see, just like the effect of God. There was something moving it, and it felt almost spiritual to him. So his love for chemistry and electricity was almost a spiritual thing. So he devoured every book he could on the subject. And then one day when he was about 15 or 16, this book fell into his hands that he had to bind that changed his life. It was called Improvement of the Mind. It's this remarkable 18th century self-help book that basically was going to instruct you, if you didn't have all the good luck in life, if you didn't go to a university, this is how you could improve your mind. This is how you could educate yourself. The book advocated being very active. You just didn't read a book, you actually went out and practiced things. You had like experiments. You were interested in science, you conducted experiments. You didn't just learn how to read and write, you learned how to draw. You just didn't read a book, you went to lectures and took notes on these lectures, et cetera, and wanted you to be very active and involved with anything that you learned. Well, Michael Faraday took this book everywhere. It was literally his second Bible. He devoured it. He applied every single idea in it. He learned how to draw. He did experiments in the back of the bookshop. He went to lectures. And not only did he take notes on every scientific lecture he went to, he would go home and then he would expand the notes into chapters full of drawings and diagrams of everything that he had seen on the stage. And after months and months of doing this, he had compiled an encyclopedia of science that was this thick, an extremely impressive encyclopedia. And one day, a man walked into the bookshop. Mr. Dance was his name, who actually belonged to the Royal Institute in England, an institute that promoted the sciences, very prestigious. And the owner was very proud of his bookbinder, and he showed him this encyclopedia that this intense 17-year-old had compiled. And Mr. Dance was astounded, and he said, I'm going to offer you something that I normally wouldn't do. And Humphrey Davy, who's the preeminent chemist in England of the time, is giving a series of lectures at the Royal Institute. It's not open to the public, but I'm going to personally invite you to this series of lectures. Michael Faraday this was heaven for him. He went to these lectures, and he took the most copious notes that he had ever taken in his life. He was so excited. But also he was a little bit discouraged. He realized that this man, Humphrey Davy, was a genius, that he thought on a whole different plane, and that by just reading books and going to lectures, Michael Faraday would never, ever be able to enter this sacred world of science. He was closed from it. He could never be Humphrey Davy by just doing what he was doing. He needed to have a mentor. He needed to somehow get entree into this secret, private world with laboratories and all of that. So he decided he would go on a little campaign. He wrote letters to all the great scientists, and he wrote letters to Humphrey Davy himself, offering his services at the most menial position. A few months later, he got a letter from Humphrey Davy himself. Humphrey Davy was temporarily blinded by one of his dangerous chemical experiments that he had done. He saw the letter from Michael Faraday, and he had heard from Mr. Dance what an intense, incredible work ethic this young man had, and he offered Michael Faraday to have 1 week with him as his personal assistant. Obviously, he took up this offer, and for that 1 week, he not only did everything that Humphrey Davy asked of him, he was so polite and respectful. He made sure that he didn't push himself too much. It wasn't so clear that he was angling for a position. He cleaned everything that he could. He just went the extra mile. But unfortunately, there was no position. There was only for 1 week. So he was back to working in the bookshop. Well, his apprenticeship was nearing an end, and he was feeling desperate. Because once his apprenticeship ended, he would have to enter the bookbinding business. And once he did that, his opportunity for entering science would be completely closed. So now he wrote Humphrey Davy again, gently reminding him of things that he had said during that week about experiments that he was maybe considering. He then sent Humphrey Davy, as a gift, the book that he had compiled of his lectures with all these beautiful drawings, a very impressive book. Once again, 2 months later, he receives a letter inviting him to come to the Royal Institute, and suddenly he was offered the job of his lifetime, to be Humphrey Davy's assistant. That very morning, Humphrey Davy's assistant had gotten into an argument with him, and he was fired for insubordination, and the opportunity of a lifetime opened itself up, and he became his apprentice. It meant a great sacrifice because he would be cleaning tubes, cleaning out the fireplace. He was going to be the most menial slave you could imagine, but this was the opportunity he had been dreaming of. Well, the rest is history. After 8 years of serving an apprenticeship on Humphrey Davy and learning all of the secrets and applying himself so diligently, he made one of the greatest discoveries in the history of science, basically an experiment I describe in the book on the nature of electromagnetism, a discovery that led to our first electric motors. It made his career. It got him into the Royal Institute, and his career was made. Now, if you look at the story of Michael Faraday from the outside, you might be tempted to say, well, man, this guy had a lot of luck, a lot of good fortune. I mean, first of all, he wanders into the one bookstore. He gets the one job where he could read books. That's pretty lucky. And the guy offers him all of these books he can read. He then gets that improvement of the mind, falls into his hands. That's a pretty lucky coup. Then that man, Mr. Dance, wanders into the store, who then can get him to see Humphrey Davy. That's pretty lucky. The fact that the guy got blinded in an experiment and needed an assistant and then got in an argument, on and on and on. This guy, it looked like pretty much good fortune that allowed Michael Faraday to get there. But that's completely ridiculous. It completely ignores the essence of the story. It was that spirit within him, that intensity, that curiosity that impressed other people. It was that inner radar that I'm talking about, that sense of fate and destiny that made him wander into that bookstore itself, and that energy that he had that impressed the owner. Any young man who wandered into his store wasn't going